Sarah had never really expected to come back to her hometown. For years, she had been chasing a dream that seemed so much bigger than the small, quiet town where she grew up. She thought that the city would give her freedom, excitement, and a sense of purpose. But now, standing at the edge of the familiar streets she had once taken for granted, she realized that dreams could sometimes leave a person feeling emptier than they had imagined. The town had not changed much. The same dusty roads stretched between rows of old wooden buildings. The same small shops lined the main street, their windows catching the golden glow of the late afternoon sun. The saloon, with its swinging doors, still stood proudly, a reminder of the stories and laughter that had once filled the air. Even the stables at the edge of town, where Luke and other cowboys tended to their horses, looked much the same as she remembered. Everything seemed frozen in time, and yet somehow everything felt different because she was different. Sarah's footsteps echoed softly as she walked down the street. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories and regrets, dreams achieved and dreams lost. The city had promised so much, but it had delivered little. She had met people, yes, but not the ones who truly understood her. She had found jobs, yes, but none that made her feel alive. The nights had been the hardest long stretches of silence in a tiny apartment, where the only sound was the hum of the heater and the occasional siren from far away. She had learned that success could be lonely, and loneliness could be sharper than any failure as she passed the diner at the corner. She remembered the times she had come here as a teenager, sitting at the counter, sipping on hot chocolate and watching the cowboys come in after a long day. There was a certain comfort in the familiar rhythm of the place, the clinking of cups, the soft hum of conversation, and the warm smell of baked bread that made the whole room feel safe. But tonight, she had no desire for food or company. She just walked past, shoulders tense, feeling the weight of years pressing down on her. Luke had always been a quiet presence in the town, the kind of man who seemed to belong to the open sky and the endless fields more than to the people. He was tall, strong, and steady, a figure who moved with calm confidence. Everyone knew him, but few really knew him. He had a reputation for being reserved, even distant, yet there was a quiet respect in the way he treated people. He didn't need to talk much. His actions and presence spoke for him. Sarah had exchanged only brief words with him over the years, mostly polite greetings and occasional nods at town events. But there was something about him that made people feel safe, as if his silence carried understanding rather than judgment. Sarah's thoughts drifted to him as she walked past the stables. She remembered the way he had helped her once years ago, when her old horse had gotten loose during a school event. While the other kids panicked, he had calmly approached the animal, speaking softly, until it allowed him to lead it back. She had been impressed then, and she was impressed now, though she would never admit it to anyone. Luke had a way of showing care without needing to explain why, a quiet strength that seemed rare and valuable. That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. The town grew quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound, every footstep, every whisper of wind seemed louder. Sarah felt the pull of loneliness more keenly now. She had thought she could escape it, but she had only carried it with her to the city, where it had grown heavier. Coming home did not make it disappear, but it offered something different. A sense that she was not completely alone. Not yet, anyway. She wandered aimlessly, finding herself near the old bridge at the edge of town, where the river ran slow and calm. It was a place she had visited often as a child, sitting on the wooden planks with her friends, skipping stones and laughing until the sun disappeared. Now she sat there alone, staring at the dark water, and felt the weight of her own thoughts pressing down. The memories were bittersweet, some happy, some painful, but all of them reminded her of who she had been and how far she had come. It was late when she finally decided to walk back toward the town center. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow on the sidewalks. A few late-night travelers passed by, nodding politely as they went. Sarah's heart ached in a way she could not quite explain. She had achieved many things, but she had not found the connection she longed for, the feeling of someone truly seeing her, understanding her, and accepting her without conditions. As she walked past the diner again, she saw him sitting at the counter, quietly eating his dinner. He looked up for a moment, giving her a brief nod, and then returned to his food. There was no judgment in his eyes, only the calm, steady presence that had always comforted people in the town. She felt a strange sense of relief, as if seeing him reminded her that even in her loneliness, there were still people who cared. In their own quiet ways, Sarah hesitated outside the door for a moment, unsure if she wanted to go in, but the pull of familiarity was too strong. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warm air wrapped around her like an old blanket, carrying the scent of coffee and baked bread. She moved toward a corner booth, far from the other customers, and sat down, letting out a deep sigh. It felt strange to be in a place she had loved as a child, yet to feel so grown up and burdened by life's disappointments. Luke continued to eat quietly, occasionally glancing toward her, but saying nothing. His silence was not cold. It was thoughtful, respectful, and oddly comforting. Sarah wondered if he understood the storm of emotions inside her, though she knew she would never truly know. She looked out the window at the empty street, watching the lights reflect on the wet pavement from an earlier drizzle. The town seemed small and quiet, but in its stillness, she felt a flicker of hope. I hoped that perhaps she could find a place here again, a place where she belonged, as the night grew darker. Sarah realized that coming back home was not just about returning to the town. It was about returning to herself, facing the parts of her life she had tried to escape. She had failed, stumbled, and felt alone, but she had also survived. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find the connection she had been seeking, not in grand gestures or distant cities, but in small, quiet moments like this, in a town that had never really changed, and in the presence of people who understood without needing to speak. She stayed at the diner long after most of the customers had left, sipping her coffee, lost in thought. The night outside was calm, almost peaceful, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply be, to exist without expectation, without fear, without the burden of loneliness pressing too hard. And though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, she felt a small, steady warmth in her chest, reminder that even in the quietest, loneliest nights, there could be moments of connection, understanding, and hope. By the time she finally left the diner, the moon was high in the sky, casting silver light across the empty streets. She walked slowly, taking in the familiar sights, feeling the cool night air against her face. And in the distance, she could see Luke heading toward the stables, moving with the calm, deliberate steps that had always marked him. She didn't speak to him, and he didn't speak to her, but their silent acknowledgement was enough. It was a quiet, unspoken understanding, a small spark of connection in a world that often felt too big, too lonely, and too overwhelming. For Sarah, that night marked the beginning of something new. It was not a grand revelation or a dramatic change, but a gentle, almost imperceptible shift. She had returned home not just to the town, but to the possibility of being understood, of finding comfort, and of discovering that even in the loneliest moments, she was not truly alone. And in the quiet, steady presence of the cowboy who said nothing, she found a strange, comforting truth. Sometimes words were not needed for connection. Sometimes simply being there was enough. The night outside had grown colder, and the quiet of the town pressed against Sarah like a heavy blanket. She walked slowly back toward her small rental house, her mind buzzing with thoughts she hadn't faced for years. Being back in her hometown brought up memories. She had tried to bury memories of friendships that had faded, of dreams that had slipped through her fingers, and of nights spent wishing for someone to simply be there. Every step she took along the familiar streets felt like a small journey back into her own past. She had not planned to meet anyone that night, but the universe seemed to have other plans. As she approached the diner, she noticed the warm glow of light spilling onto the street. Inside, Luke was still sitting quietly at the counter. His presence was steady and calm, as if the world outside, chaotic, loud, and demanding, could not touch him. He did not speak, but somehow, in that silence, he seemed to offer reassurance, a reminder that there were people in this world who could simply exist without asking for anything in return. Sarah hesitated at the door, unsure if she wanted to enter again. But the pull of familiarity was too strong. The diner had always felt like a refuge, a place where she could gather herself without the pressure of expectations. When she stepped inside, the warmth hit her immediately. The smell of coffee and baked bread enveloped her, and for a moment, she felt a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in years. She moved toward the counter. Settling onto a stool a little distance from Luke, he noticed her presence but did not comment or even look up fully. The silence between them was not awkward. It was shared, a quiet understanding that neither needed to explain themselves. Sarah ordered a cup of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she wrapped them around the warm mug. She had not realized how tense she had been until she felt the heat seep into her fingers. Grounding her, as she sipped her coffee, her mind wandered to the city she had left behind. She had imagined herself thriving there, surrounded by opportunities and new people. But the reality had been far different. Long hours at work, endless noise, and the constant pressure to perform had worn her down. She had returned home not because she had failed completely, but because she realized that success without connection felt hollow. She longed for the simple companionship she had once taken for granted in this small town, the kind of connection that didn't require constant attention or explanation. Just the quiet presence of someone who understood. Luke finally spoke, his voice low and calm, breaking the silence without disrupting it. "You look tired." It was not a question, but an observation, simple and factual. Sarah looked at him, surprised that he had noticed something so obvious. Most people in the city would have glanced and moved on without a second thought. But Luke had always had a way of seeing people without needing to interrogate them. "I am," she admitted, her voice soft. "It's been a long time." She did not elaborate, and he did not press. There was no need. The understanding between them did not require explanations or excuses. In the quiet of the diner, the two of them shared a moment that was more profound than any conversation could have been. Sarah's thoughts drifted back to her childhood. She remembered walking past the same diner with her friends, laughing and joking, feeling a sense of belonging that seemed so distant now. She remembered watching Luke ride past on his horse, always calm, always steady, always seemingly at ease with the world. She had admired him then, though she had never admitted it. And now, years later, she realized that admiration had grown into something deeper, recognition of his quiet strength. The kind that could support others without being asked. The kind that could make someone feel safe simply by being present. The diner grew quieter as the night went on. Most of the other patrons had left, leaving only a few scattered souls who kept to themselves. Sarah felt a sense of intimacy in the emptiness, as if the world outside had disappeared and it was just the two of them. The silence was comfortable now, no longer oppressive. It allowed her to breathe, to think, and to reflect on what had brought her here. She found herself speaking, almost without thinking. I don't want to sleep alone tonight again," she whispered. The words were soft, almost a confession, but they carried the weight of years of loneliness. She looked at Luke, unsure of what to expect. Some part of her feared rejection, another part hoped for understanding. Luke did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, his eyes calm and steady, and for the first time, Sarah realized that words were not always necessary. His presence alone was enough to convey what he could not or would not say. He did not judge, he did not question, and he did not try to fix anything. He simply was there, and that simple act carried more comfort than any words could have. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the diner and the soft ticking of the clock marking the passage of time. Sarah felt a strange relief wash over her. She had expected awkwardness, discomfort, maybe even dismissal. But instead, she found acceptance, quiet acknowledgement of her feelings, without the need for explanation or justification. It was a moment of understanding so rare that it took her breath away. As the minutes passed, she realized that her loneliness, though not entirely gone, felt less heavy. The simple act of being seen, even without words, had a profound impact. She remembered all the times she had longed for connection in the city, all the nights spent feeling invisible, and she understood now that sometimes presence mattered more than conversation. Sometimes, simply being there for someone was enough. Luke finally spoke. his voice low and calm, breaking the silence in a gentle way. "Do you want to come for a walk?" he asked. There was no pressure in his tone, no expectation, only an invitation. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The decision felt natural, almost inevitable. She followed him out into the night, feeling the cool air against her face, the quiet streets welcoming them like old friends. They walked slowly, side by side, their steps falling into an unspoken rhythm. Sarah found herself talking, telling him about her life in the city, her struggles and her disappointments. Luke listened quietly, occasionally nodding, never interrupting, never offering solutions. His calm presence allowed her to speak freely, to release thoughts she had carried for too long. She realized that this was what she had been seeking all along. Not advice, not rescue, not judgment, but simply someone who would listen, who would be present, who would care without demanding anything in return as they walked past the stables. Sarah saw Luke's horses quietly grazing in the moonlight. The scene felt peaceful, grounding, and real. She remembered the times she had admired him from a distance. The way he moved with quiet confidence, the way he cared for the animals without ever making a show of it. Now, walking beside him, she understood the depth of his character, the kind of quiet strength that could hold space for others. That could offer comfort without words. It could make someone feel less alone simply by being there. They continued walking until they reached a small park at the edge of town. A bench sat under a large oak tree, its branches stretching toward the sky. Luke gestured toward it, and they both sat down, letting the night surround them. The silence returned, but it no longer felt heavy. It was filled with understanding, shared experience, and a subtle sense of relief. Sarah realized that sometimes the best moments were not the ones filled with conversation or action, but the ones where two people could exist together, quietly, comfortably. And without pretense, hours seemed to pass in minutes. They shared stories, small confessions, and laughter that felt like it had been missing from Sarah's life for too long. The night was simple, ordinary, yet profound. It reminded her that connection did not always need to be dramatic or extraordinary. Sometimes it was in the small, quiet moments, the shared glances, the gentle nods, the silent understanding by the time they returned toward the town center. The first hints of dawn were appearing on the horizon. Sarah felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years, a sense that the weight of her loneliness had been lifted, even if only slightly. She realized that coming back home was not about escaping her past or finding immediate answers. It was about discovering that connection was still possible, even in unexpected ways, and that people like Luke, quiet, steady, understanding, could make life feel a little less lonely as they parted ways. Sarah felt a sense of gratitude she could not fully express. She had expected nothing from the night, yet she had received something far more valuable than she could have imagined. It was not romance, not rescue, not drama. It was understanding, presence, and a gentle reminder that she was not truly alone. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope that the loneliness she had carried for so long could be eased. That connection could still be found in that small moments. Shared quietly with someone who cared could make all the difference. The days after that quiet night passed in a haze of thought for Sarah. She went about her usual routine, visiting the grocery store, walking along the streets she knew so well, sitting in the diner, but her mind always drifted back to Luke. He was always calm, quiet, and steady, a presence she could rely on without needing to demand it. And yet that very steadiness now brought a new challenge. She had begun to realize just how much she had depended on her own solitude for so long, and how unfamiliar it felt to want someone near. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. For years, she had built walls around herself, convincing herself that independence was the only way to survive. She had believed that needing someone, even just for company, was a weakness. But Luke's quiet understanding had shown her another truth, that wanting connection did not make her weak, it made her human. And as she sat in the diner one evening watching him across the counter, she felt both comforted and anxious. She was comforted because he was there, and anxious because she had no idea what this new feeling would bring. The turning point came unexpectedly. Sarah had spent the afternoon helping at a small charity event in town, organizing donations and talking to neighbors. She had felt useful, connected, and alive in a way that she had not felt in years. But as the day ended, a heavy sadness crept over her. The event was over, and the warmth of shared work vanished into the emptiness of the evening. She realized that the loneliness she had been running from was not something she could outrun. It followed her, quiet and persistent like a shadow she could never fully escape. Walking home through the dimly lit streets, she noticed movement near the old barn on the edge of town. Luke's horse grazed calmly, and he was there too, speaking softly to the animal. Sarah hesitated, unsure if she should approach. She stepped closer. The sight of him so calm, so grounded, brought a strange comfort. He looked up briefly, giving her a small nod, and continued speaking to the horse. It was a gesture of recognition, a simple acknowledgement that she was there. For some reason, it was enough to make her feel less alone. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She kept turning over the same thoughts in her mind, the same doubts, fears, and insecurities that had haunted her for years. She remembered every moment she had spent trying to fill her life with work, travel, and distractions, only to return to an apartment that felt emptier than ever. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt the urge to reach out, to lean on someone else, and it terrified her. She was afraid of rejection, afraid of misunderstanding, afraid of appearing vulnerable, and yet she could not ignore the truth. She wanted Luke's presence. The following evening, she found herself back at the diner, hoping he would be there. He was, sitting at his usual spot, quiet and focused on his meal. This time, however, the air between them felt heavier. The comfort of silence had been replaced by an unspoken tension. Sarah wanted to speak, to express the flood of emotions that had taken over her, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. She realized that this was the moment where things could change for better or worse. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "I don't know how to do this. It's asking for someone to be here." Luke looked at her, his eyes calm, not judging, not rushing, but fully present. He did not speak immediately. His silence was intentional, allowing her to feel safe even in her uncertainty, and that more than anything made her heart ache with longing. She had never experienced someone being so steady, so patient. In the midst of her confusion and fear, days turned into nights, and the tension grew. Sarah tried to return to her old routines, but everything felt different now. City's promises had long faded, leaving her unsure of what she truly wanted. The town felt both familiar and strange, comforting and challenging at the same time. Luke's presence reminded her that connection was possible, yet also highlighted her fear of relying on someone else. She realized that the biggest obstacle was not the town or Luke, or even her loneliness was herself, and the walls she had built over the years to protect her heart. One evening, as a storm rolled in, Sarah found herself walking along the riverbank. The rain soaking through her jacket, her hair plastered to her face. She was angry, frustrated, and overwhelmed. She had spent years trying to manage life on her own, and now, faced with the simple act of wanting someone near, she felt weak. She wanted to cry, scream, and release the pressure she had held inside for so long. And as the rain fell harder, she realized she had to confront the truth. Her loneliness had become unbearable, and she needed help even if it terrified her. At that moment, Luke appeared, coming quietly from the path that ran along the river. He did not speak at first, simply walking beside her, letting her energy fill the silence. And in that simple act, walking together in the storm, neither rushing nor pushing, Sarah felt a release she had not expected. She began to speak, voice trembling, telling him about the nights she had spent alone, about the emptiness that had followed her everywhere, about the fear of being left behind. Luke listened, nodding occasionally, never interrupting, never offering empty words of comfort. His presence alone was enough. They walked for hours, neither noticing the time passing, until the storm began to ease. Sarah felt lighter, but the emotional weight of confronting herself had not disappeared. She realized that this was the critical moment, the turning point where her life could shift. She could continue carrying her loneliness like a secret burden, or she could allow someone in, even if it meant exposing the vulnerabilities she had kept hidden for so long. Over the next few days, Sarah and Luke spent more time together, their interactions filled with quiet conversation, shared tasks, and subtle gestures of care. They worked on repairing a small fence at the edge of town, fed the horses together, and sometimes simply sat in silence, watching the sun set. The world outside seemed distant and unimportant. In those moments, nothing else mattered but the shared presence of the two of them. Yet, with every step forward, Sarah felt the weight of fear pressing against her chest. She had learned over the years that trust was fragile. Letting someone in could bring both comfort and heartbreak. Then came the night that tested everything. Sarah had spent the day helping at the library, organizing books, and reading to local children. She returned home exhausted but satisfied, feeling the small joys of being part of a community. Yet as she walked toward the diner that evening, she noticed a familiar shadow across the street. Luke, standing near the old barn, looking distant and troubled. She felt a pang of worry. Something was different tonight, heavier, and she sensed that the unspoken tension between them had reached a peak. Approaching him, she spoke softly. "Luke, are you okay?" He did not respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the ground, and for the first time, Sarah saw the weight of responsibility and worry in his expression. He finally spoke, voice low and deliberate. "I'm not sure I know how to help you." Those words hit her harder than she expected. She realized that their connection, as comforting as it had been, was now being tested. She had grown dependent on his presence, and the thought that he might not know how to support her brought fear bubbling to the surface. For the first time, she truly understood that human connection was not simple. It required effort, understanding, and vulnerability from both sides. The rain started falling again. Heavier this time, as if the sky mirrored the intensity of their emotions. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to run, to retreat to the safety of her apartment, but she knew that this moment was crucial. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she admitted, voice trembling. "I don't want to keep carrying this by myself." Luke's response was quiet but steady. He stepped closer, not pushing her, not offering solutions, but simply being there. "You're not alone," he said. And in that simple phrase, Sarah felt a mixture of relief, fear, and hope. She understood that connection was not about solving every problem, but about standing together, even when the path was uncertain. That night, as the storm continued, they remained outside the barn, talking softly, sharing stories of past struggles and unspoken fears. It was a long, emotional night, filled with tears, laughter, and moments of quiet reflection. Sarah realized that the storm outside mirrored the turmoil she had carried inside for so long. And yet, for the first time, she felt that the storm could be faced not alone, but together. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the town glistening under the early sun. Sarah felt exhausted but lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. She understood that the emotional peak of their journey had passed, and that the real challenge now was to continue nurturing trust and connection. Luke's quiet presence had shown her that vulnerability was not weakness, and that letting someone in could bring both challenges and immense comfort. For Sarah, this was the moment of crisis and clarity. The realization hit her that life's hardships could not always be faced alone, and that the courage to be vulnerable could open doors to unexpected connection. Luke had not changed. He was still the quiet, steady cowboy she had known, but she had changed. She had allowed herself to confront her fears, express her needs, and embrace the possibility of support from another person. After the storm had passed, the town seemed different, quieter, and yet alive in its own way. The sun sparkled on wet streets, and the air smelled fresh, carrying hints of grass and earth. Sarah woke that morning feeling both exhausted and strangely hopeful. The night with Luke had left her emotionally raw, but it had also given her something she had not felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. She understood that connecting with someone was not always simple or easy, but the presence of another human being, steady and patient, could make the weight of life's burdens easier to bear. Sarah decided to step outside, taking a slow walk through the town. She noticed familiar places with a new sense of appreciation: the small park where she had spent afternoons as a child, the library where she had once spent hours reading, and the diner that had become a place of quiet comfort. Every familiar sight reminded her of how much had stayed the same and how much she had changed. She no longer felt the same distance from her hometown. It was as if she was seeing it through fresh eyes. When she reached the stables, she saw Luke already at work, tending to the horses. He moved with his usual calm precision, brushing the animals gently, feeding them carefully, and checking on their hooves. Sarah watched him for a moment, noticing the quiet dedication in his actions. It struck her that he had a way of showing care without fanfare or words, a gentle reminder that connection could be expressed through actions as well as conversation. She realized that part of what drew her to him was this steady, unwavering presence. Luke noticed her standing at the edge of the stables and gave her a small nod. "Morning," he said, voice low and calm. There was no pressure in his tone, only a simple acknowledgement of her presence. Sarah returned the nod and walked over. Feeling the familiar mix of nervousness and comfort she had come to associate with him. She had spent years avoiding vulnerability, yet here, with Luke, she felt safe enough to let her guard down a little. They worked together in silence for a while, feeding the horses and repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in the storm. Sarah found that the quiet teamwork was grounding. It allowed her to focus on the task at hand, while also being near someone she trusted. The simple act of sharing work brought them closer, not through words, but through shared effort and understanding. She noticed how naturally they fell into a rhythm together, each movement coordinated without the need for discussion. It was a small but meaningful way to connect, a reminder that support could be expressed through action. After finishing their work, Luke suggested they sit by the edge of the field, where the morning sun bathed the grass in golden light. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then agreed. They sat on the fence, looking out over the open fields, the horses grazing quietly nearby. The silence between them was comfortable this time, filled with a sense of shared understanding rather than tension. Sarah felt her heart lighten as she realized that the breakthrough they needed was not a dramatic declaration or an immediate solution, but a series of small, consistent moments like this, moments of presence, patience, and trust. Finally, she spoke, voice soft but steady. "I've spent so long trying to handle everything by myself," she said, glancing at him. "I didn't realize how heavy it was until now." Luke nodded, not interrupting, letting her words settle in the quiet morning air. "It's not weakness to want help," he said finally. "It's human. Everyone needs someone sometimes." Those simple words struck her deeply. They were not grand promises, nor were they overly sentimental. They were honest and real. Exactly what she needed to hear, for the first time. Sarah felt the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. She realized that the fear of depending on someone else had kept her from experiencing the kind of quiet support she craved. With Luke, there was no pressure, no expectation, only the possibility of shared presence. That understanding was freeing. She did not need to pretend to be strong all the time. She could simply be herself, vulnerable and imperfect, and still be accepted. The next few days were filled with similar small breakthroughs. Sarah and Luke spent time together repairing fences, gathering firewood, and caring for the animals. They shared simple meals, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Each shared moment built trust, gradually creating a bond that neither could ignore. Sarah discovered that emotional breakthroughs were not sudden. They were built over time in small gestures, quiet conversations, and the patience to simply be there for one another. One evening, after a long day working with the horses, they sat on the porch of the stables. Watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky turned shades of pink and orange, reflecting on the calm water of the nearby pond. Sarah felt a sense of peace she had not experienced in years. She realized that she had been so focused on the past and mistakes, missed opportunities and loneliness, that she had forgotten to appreciate the present. Luke's quiet presence reminded her that life could still hold beauty, even in small, everyday moments. As night fell, Sarah admitted another truth to herself. She was afraid. She had spent so long alone that the idea of depending on someone else felt risky. She feared disappointment, rejection, and loss. But she also understood that continuing to shut people out was no longer sustainable. She needed to trust, to take a step toward connection, even if it meant vulnerability. Luke had shown her that trust was not about grand gestures or promises. It was about consistent presence, patience, and understanding. Over the next few weeks, their bond grew stronger. Sarah began to feel a sense of belonging she had not felt since childhood. She realized that the breakthrough was not a single moment, but a series of actions and experiences that slowly eroded her loneliness. Each shared task, quiet conversation, and simple gesture of care built a foundation of trust and understanding. She no longer felt the constant pressure to handle everything alone. Instead, she discovered that asking for help and accepting support could be a source of strength. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence damaged by another small storm, Sarah noticed a small smile on Luke's face as he worked. It was subtle, quiet, but it carried warmth. She realized that he had always been capable of this kind of steady care, but that he had never needed to show it dramatically. The recognition of his calm dedication brought a new depth to her appreciation of him. She understood that relationships were not always about dramatic moments, but about small, consistent acts that demonstrated care and reliability. That evening, as they finished their work and cleaned up the stables, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come to the town expecting loneliness and isolation, yet she had found connection and understanding. Luke had shown her that support could be quiet and steady, that presence could speak louder than words, and that trust could be built gradually, without pressure or expectation. She felt a sense of emotional breakthrough she had longed for, a reminder that vulnerability could lead to strength rather than weakness. The breakthrough continued in subtle ways. Sarah found herself sharing stories from her past, talking about childhood memories, past mistakes, and hopes for the future. Luke listened patiently, never interrupting, never judging. His presence alone allowed her to explore emotions she had kept buried for years. She discovered that the act of being heard and understood could be transformative, giving her a renewed sense of hope and belonging. By the end of Part 4, Sarah had begun to realize that the emotional breakthroughs they experienced were not the end of their journey, but a critical step in learning how to trust and connect. She understood that life would still bring challenges, loneliness, and moments of fear, but the difference now was that she did not have to face them alone. Luke's quiet, steady presence had shown her that connection was possible, that vulnerability could be met with understanding, and that the smallest gestures could carry the greatest meaning. She reflected on the journey she had taken from isolation in the city, to returning to her hometown, to the stormy night that revealed her need for connection, and finally, to the steady progress of trust and understanding with Luke. Each step had been significant, teaching her that emotional breakthroughs were not instantaneous, but the result of patience, care, and consistent presence. She felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the knowledge that she could rely on someone without fear, that she could accept support without shame, and that connection could be quiet, steady, and profoundly meaningful. The days slowly turned into weeks, and Sarah felt a change within herself she hadn't expected. The quiet mornings, the slow walks through town, the small shared tasks with Luke, they had become a rhythm she had come to rely on. But more importantly, she had begun to notice a deeper shift inside her heart. The loneliness that had once pressed so heavily against her chest had loosened its grip. She could still feel it at times, but now it no longer seemed insurmountable. It was a reminder, not a burden. A reminder that connection, patience, understanding could ease even the heaviest of emotional weights. Sarah began to see her hometown with renewed eyes. The streets, the small shops, the familiar diner. The old bridge near the river, they were no longer symbols of stagnation or confinement. Instead, they felt alive, filled with possibility. Even the mundane tasks of daily life, which she had once considered dull or isolating, now seemed meaningful because they were shared experiences. Cooking a simple meal, repairing a fence, feeding the horses, these acts were no longer solitary chores. They were moments of connection, of presence, of being part of something larger than herself. Luke remained a steady presence in her life, not by overwhelming her with attention, but through his quiet consistency. He had never rushed her, never demanded explanations, never judged her fears or vulnerabilities. Instead, he allowed her to exist alongside him, to share her thoughts and feelings at her own pace. Sarah realized that this was a rare gift, one she had unconsciously longed for years. The feeling of being understood without the pressure to perform or explain was profoundly comforting. It gave her courage to explore her emotions, to admit fears, and to embrace hope. One late afternoon, as they finished repairing a small section of fence near the stables, Sarah paused to watch Luke carefully lead a young horse into the paddock. The sun cast a warm glow across the field, illuminating the quiet dedication in his movements. She marveled at how naturally he cared for the animals, and how that same patience and calm extended to her. She realized that his strength wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steadfast, and dependable. And in a world that often demanded constant activity and attention, that kind of steadiness was priceless. They sat on the edge of the field for a while, watching the sunset together. Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. The colors of the sky reflected in her thoughts, painting them with warmth and calm. She realized that the breakthrough they had achieved together was not a single dramatic moment, but a continuous series of small actions, shared experiences, and patient understanding. Every gesture, every conversation, every moment of quiet presence had brought them closer and allowed her to heal from years of loneliness. Sarah began to reflect on her journey. She thought about the city, the dreams she had chased, and the disappointments she had faced. She remembered the nights spent alone, the anxiety that had gnawed at her, and the feeling of invisibility that had followed her everywhere. Those experiences had shaped her, yes, but they no longer defined her. She had returned home seeking solace and unexpectedly found connection. She had been reminded that life could offer comfort in the smallest moments, and that even the quietest presence could change everything. One evening, after helping Luke gather firewood for the coming week, they sat by the porch of the stables, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Sarah felt the steady rhythm of Luke's breathing beside her and realized that she no longer feared his presence. She could sit in silence with him and feel understood. The words she had longed to hear were no longer necessary. His consistency and patience had spoken them for her. She understood now that emotional connection did not always require grand gestures. It could thrive in quiet, steady companionship. Sarah also reflected on her own growth. She had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but a gateway to trust and understanding. By admitting her loneliness, her fears, and her desire for connection, she had opened the door to genuine companionship. Luke's response had been consistent and kind, allowing her to feel safe in sharing her deepest thoughts. She realized that growth was not about suddenly changing who she was, but about embracing her humanity, her imperfections. In her need for support, as the weeks continued, Sarah noticed how the town itself seemed to reflect her own internal changes. The streets felt brighter, the people more approachable, the familiar places infused with meaning she had overlooked before. She had once felt trapped by her own expectations, burdened by the weight of solitude. Now, she understood that returning home had not been a step backward, it had been a step toward herself, toward understanding what she truly needed. And what she needed was not grand adventures or distant dreams, but quiet presence, consistent support, and genuine care. While walking along the riverbank with Luke, Sarah felt the soft grass beneath her feet, the wind against her face, and the gentle murmur of water flowing nearby. She turned to him, feeling an unexpected surge of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being patient, for just being here." Luke smiled faintly, his expression calm and reassuring. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "We all need someone sometimes." Sarah felt her chest relax. She understood that gratitude was not just for Luquette, was for herself, the courage she had found to open her heart. The breakthrough continued in the simplest ways. Sarah found herself laughing more, noticing the small joys of everyday life, and feeling hope where there had once been despair. She no longer dreaded the nights, nor did she fear the silence. Even when she was alone, she felt connected, because she had learned that the strength of human presence could be internalized. She carried the lessons of trust, patience, and shared understanding with her, allowing her to face life with greater resilience and peace. The town had become more than a place to return to. It had become a place to grow, to heal, and to embrace life fully. Sarah realized that her journey had not been about escaping the city or returning to familiar streets. It had been about reconnecting with herself, learning to ask for support, and discovering that companionship could be quiet, steady, and profoundly meaningful. Every shared task, every conversation, every moment of presence had become a thread weaving together a stronger, more connected life. As she sat by the stables one evening, watching the sun set over the fields, Sarah reflected on her transformation. She had learned that life's challenges did not need to be faced alone, that vulnerability could bring strength, and that trust could be built gradually through consistent, caring presence. She realized that Luke had not saved her, and she had not saved him. Instead, they had walked together side by side, learning from one another and supporting each other through patience, understanding, and quiet companionship. By the end of this chapter of her life, Sarah understood that the most profound connections were not always loud or dramatic. They were quiet, steady, and built through small, consistent actions. She no longer feared loneliness because she had discovered the power of shared presence. She had learned that emotional breakthroughs were not instantaneous, but the result of patience, care, and genuine understanding. And most importantly, she had learned that asking for support, letting someone in, and embracing vulnerability were acts of courage that could change life in ways she had never imagined. Sarah walked through the town one last time before nightfall. Feeling the soft glow of streetlights on her face, she noticed the familiar sights with gratitude, the small diner where she had spent so many nights reflecting, the old bridge by the river where storms had once mirrored her emotions, and the fields where she had walked with Luke in quiet understanding. Every step felt lighter, every breath freer. She had returned home seeking comfort and had found connection, understanding, and a deeper sense of herself. As she approached the stables, Luke was there, quietly tending to the horses as always. He looked up, giving her a small, calm nod. Sarah smiled, feeling the warmth of the bond they had built. Words were unnecessary. They had already shared the most important lessons in quiet moments, steady presence, and mutual understanding. She understood that life would continue to bring challenges, but the difference now was that she had learned how to face them with courage, trust, and the knowledge that she was not alone. The night fell softly, covering the town in a blanket of stars. Sarah sat on the porch of the stables, watching the sky reflect in the still waters of the nearby pond. She felt peace, gratitude, and hope all at once. She had come full circle from loneliness and fear to connection and understanding, to a quiet yet profound sense of belonging. And as she breathed in the cool night air, she realized that the journey was not over. Life would continue, with joys and challenges, but she was ready. She carried with her the lessons of presence, trust, and vulnerability, the knowledge that true connection could change everything. Even the quietest nights of solitude, in the silence of that night, Sarah allowed herself to feel fully alive, fully seen, and fully understood. She had learned that human connection did not always require words, grand gestures, or perfect timing. Sometimes it was enough to simply be present, to listen, to share, and to care.